We left off last video getting the structure of our appetizer list view cell up and running. Now we need to start building the network call to populate this with actual real data from the server, not our mock data. So the first thing we're going to do is set up our network manager. Real quick disclaimer, there are a bunch of different ways to do network calls. For example, if you use Alamo Fire, that's fine. If you make your network calls much more generic, cool. If you use something like a request builder, awesome. There's so many different ways to do this. I'm keeping this very basic, very fundamental, right down the middle, for learning purposes. So just keep that in mind. If you have a different way of doing network calls, feel free to do that. That's fine. If you're here and you're not familiar with network calls, this is a good opportunity to kind of learn the fundamental way to do it, and then you can explore other options later. Okay, disclaimer out of the way. Let's create a new file in appetizers, Command N, Swift file. So I'm going to create a network manager, hit create, and it's going to be a singleton. So we'll do a final class called network manager. And the first thing we're going to do is static let shared, right? This creates our singleton network manager. And then I need a private init and just an empty implementation of it. So what this did was create our singleton, right? We'll do network manager.shared to access the singleton, and then we're going to have functions on this that you'll see here. But that's the basic setup of the singleton. Why a singleton, you may ask? Well, if you look at Apple's documentations on that, they actually recommend things like network managers be a singleton. There's a whole other pattern other than doing things like manager. Again, that's fine. Keeping it simple. And sorry if I keep repeating myself with these disclaimers. That's just 4 years of hearing thousands and thousands of comments about my code. Like I can just see the comments before they happen. So I try to give those disclaimers. If you're sick of hearing that, I apologize. So the properties I want to set up on our network manager first are the URLs. So we'll do static let base URL, and I'll explain why I'm doing this here in a second. Equals, and this is going to be our URL string that we use to seal our JSON. Again, that is going to be in the description of the video. Feel free to copy and paste that here. So it's a string, Command V, and that's not our base URL. That's really like the whole URL, right? So the base URL would be, the Heroku app.swiftui fundamentals. And then, right, each individual endpoint would be /appetizers / whatever other endpoints we have. This is going to be the only endpoint on the app, but I'm showing you how I structure it for like a kind of like a real app. So for example, I would do static this is kind of like a whole list of URLs that I would have. Static let appetizer URL equals, and then the string would be base URL plus, and then I would take the appetizers and put it here. And then make sure we delete the appetizers here. I usually keep the / there so I don't have to repeat it in the back end of my URL every time. So that's the general setup of our network manager. Now what we need to do is write the individual functions that will be our network calls, right? This app is going to have two. We're going to have one to get the appetizers, retrieve that from the JSON that we just saw, and then we're going to have one to download the images from a URL, to download our appetizer images. So those are the two network calls that are going to eventually be in our network manager. For right now, we're just doing the get appetizers one. Func get appetizers, and then here's our completion handler completed, and it's going to be an @escaping, and that is going to return a result. And then the result is going to have two values. One is going to be our array of appetizers. I'm going to explain this, give an overview of this real quick when I'm done typing. And then the other piece of information the result is going to have is an error. We're going to create our own custom error here in a bit, but for now, to get Xcode to stop yelling, just call it an error. And that's going to return void. All right, and then open and close brackets to get the scope of the function. So that is our function signature. So I'll run through this now. I'll keep it at a high level because, again, results can be a whole video. In fact, I've done a whole video on results. I'll link to that in the description if you want to dive in. I've done a whole video on escaping closures. So I'm not going down those rabbit holes, but high level, the function is get appetizers. Once that is completed, we're going to have a result. That result is either going to have an an array of appetizers, which is what we want. That's the success case, or it's going to return an error. That would be the failure case. And speaking of that error, let's take a second real quick to build our custom error before we start writing this function, because we're going to use that custom error throughout this function. So I'm going to go to appetizers here, Command N for a new file, new Swift file. We'll call this AP for appetizers error. I usually like to preface it with the first two letters, of the app. So AP error, and we're going to make this an enum called AP error. And we're going to have 4 cases, right? Case invalid URL, case our URL is messed up, case invalid response, case invalid data. So invalid response is, when we get like a 404 or 500 or whatever from the server. Invalid data is if, the data we get back, we can't parse that out. Something's wrong there. And then case unable to complete. We're going to use this one for just the general error, right? Like if the Wi-Fi is turned off or something like that. You'll see how we'll use these in a second, but I had to create them before we can use them. So back to our network manager. Okay, so now instead of returning just a Swift error, oh, I forgot something. Back to AP error. In order to use the AP error here, it has to conform to Swift's error protocol. So that's what I forgot. AP error can't just conform to nothing. It's got to conform to error. There we go. Forgot. Key piece of information here. So now in Network Manager, I can replace this just generic Swift error with our AP error. And that will work because we conform to the error protocol. Cool. And like I said, you're going to see how we use these errors in the network call. So I'm going to run through building this function. I'll talk through it, but at the end, I'm going to come back and walk through it just like I always do to hopefully make it make sense. So the first thing I want to check on is make sure the URL that I'm trying to use works. So guard let URL equals, and we want it to be, because we don't want to create a URL object, right? Not just the URL string. We have to create the URL object, and we want to create that URL object from a string, right? There you go. And the string we want is our appetizer URL, right? Because we're doing get appetizers. That's the endpoint that we want to hit. Appetizer URL. And then, yep, our guard statement needs an else, right? So what we're doing here basically is when you create a URL from a string, it's an optional in case it doesn't work. So if we actually get, I made this static instead of private. Oops, got my my keywords mixed up there. Okay, so now back to what I was saying. URL from a string returns an optional, so we want to make sure, it's not nil. If it's nil, that means we couldn't create a URL object from the string, so we want to return an error, right? So we want to call completed. This is our completion handler here. And in this case, we want to initialize that with a .failure case. And then the error we want to pass in, right? This is how our result works, is we want to pass in invalid URL. This way we know what type of error happened here, and then we'll hit return. So cool. Get used to this structure. We're going to be using something similar a lot to check for all the other data. But right now we're just checking to make sure we have a good URL before we try to use that URL to make a network call. That's basically what's going on here. And again, if we have a bad one, return that specific error. So that's the first check, the URL. Now we can actually start creating our data task to download the information. So we can do let task equals URL session.shared.data task. And we want to do with request, but we want to have the completion handler, right? You see, we want to get back data, response, or an error, right? So data task with request that has that completion handler. So the URL request we want to create, let's create a new one. URL request with the initializer. You can see it takes in a URL. Good thing we checked to make sure we had a good URL up here. So we're going to pass that URL in. Now the completion handler, I'm just going to hit return here, and I can name these whatever I want, but I'm going to name it basically exactly what they have. Data, response, and you can see they're all optional. So this is what we're going to have to check to make sure we have these items, right? And I don't like these parentheses here. They're optional. Less clutter. Keep them if you want. Okay, so now what we're going to get back in this completion handler is data, response, and error, and they're all optional. So that's what you're going to see us do. We're going to unwrap all these optionals and handle them accordingly. So first, let's tackle the error case. So guard let underscore. We're not going to be using the error equals error else, and we're going to pass in the error here, unable to complete. So else we'll do completed with the failure case of .unable to complete, because again, this usually happens when the Wi-Fi is not working. That's just one example. Then we want to return here. So basically we're saying, hey, if error is not equal to nil, go ahead, fire off the failure case and pass in unable to complete as the error. Okay, so that takes care of the error. Same thing with response. So guard let response equal response. Oh, okay, response has a P in it. I thought that looked weird when I typed it, but my mind's elsewhere trying to explain things. So guard let response equals response. And then we're going to cast this as an HTTP response because we want to get a specific code here. So if we have a good response, let's also make sure the response dot status code equals 200. And then now we'll do else. And let me walk you through that here. So basically what we're saying is, hey, is response not nil? Cool. If it is, cast it as URL response, and then take that response that we got and then check the status code on it to make sure it's the 200. If you're not familiar with HTTP status codes, 200 is usually the, hey, things went good. So we're making sure we got a 200 back. This is where you could check against the status code, like, hey, if I got a 404, send back this error. If I got a 500, send back this error, right? You can really tailor your error messages based on the status code. We're not going to go that deep. We're basically just going to get a pass-fail just to keep it simple. So if we don't get a 200 here, or if response is nil for some reason, we're going to call completed and then pass in the failure case of .invalid response. And again, I'm keeping these kind of high level and generic, but we've taken care of our error. We've taken care of our response. Data is the good stuff, right? Data is our array of appetizers that we get back if we get it, but we got to check to make sure we have it first before we use that data. So again, guard let data equals data, else completed dot failure case with dot invalid data and return. And I forgot the return up here, right? Because if we get a bad response, we don't want to run the rest of the code. If we get bad data, we don't want to run the rest of the code, right? We just want to exit out. That's why we're returning right there. Okay, now that we made sure we have data, now's the good stuff. All this up here was just all the bad stuff, right? Checking for all the errors. If we made it past all those checks, now we have our data, and now we can parse that data and create our appetizer array from the JSON. So we'll do that with a do try catch block. So do, we'll say let decoder equals a JSON decoder. Remember we talked about encoding and decoding. We want to decode the JSON, right? So let's create our decoder here and let's say let decoded response, right? This is where this will give us the our object here equals, and here's where we need to do the try, right? So decoder.decode, and then it's from, well, what type do we want to decode? And this goes back to our model, right? A review from last video here, back to our appetizer, right? If we can't just decode an array of appetizers, because remember, our JSON is not structured that way. Our JSON, if we look into our response, remember our JSON was structured with a request that had an array of appetizers. So in decodable, this is what we want to decode, our appetizer response. Speaking of, I forgot to do this. We got to make this decodable. And a note on codable and decodable, the reason I can just add that and not have any extra code is because all the underlying types conform to codable. And the underlying type here is an appetizer. But if you look at our appetizer, all these basic, things, right? Int, string, double, int, those are all going to conform to codable. If you have really weird, unique types, you may have to write some extra boilerplate code. But as long as you're using these fundamental ones or foundational ones, I guess, because it's in foundation, you'll be fine to just conform to decodable without writing any extra code. So anyway, we're going to decode our appetizer response, which is going to have an array of appetizers attached to it, right? So by decoding the response, we're also decoding all the appetizers as well. Okay, so back to the network manager, that's what we want to decode. The type we want is our appetizer response. And you have to do .self here. And then what do you want to decode that from, right? It takes in data. Well, this is the data that we made sure we had up here, right? So pass in that data. Cool. So basically what we're saying here is from the data that we have, decode that data into an appetizer response. And again, our appetizer response is going to hold our array of appetizers. And speaking of that array of appetizers, as a reminder, look, that's what our result types returns, an array of appetizers. So now we want to handle the success case, right? This whole time we've been doing completed failure, talking about failures, right? Now we want to do completed .success, and you can see the success case takes in an array of appetizers, what I just pointed out up top. So now we want to pass in decoded response .appetizers and do Command B. I think it's telling me that, yeah, I need to do the catch case here, I think. Let's put this in here and let's just do completed. So basically, if we can't decode correctly, we're going to pass in the .failure case, and that case is going to be invalid data, right? Because our data was messed up. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not decoded response.appetizers, it's decoded response.request. Because if you look at our model, and we just named it that way, like we could have named this appetizers, but I wanted it to match the structure of the JSON. So that's why we did that. If you want to name it differently, fine. But that's why we do decoded response.request, because that's what it is. And then again, if that decoding fails, we completed with the failure of invalid data. And then the last piece of the network call puzzle that many forget, and it always trips people up, and this is why I like this error right here. It says, hey, you initialize a task, but you never actually use the task. Aha, that's my reminder to do task.resume down here. And I think I'm in the wrong scope. Too many curly braces. So I didn't get the autocomplete because I'm in the wrong scope. So now we do it down here. There we go. Command B, make sure that's all good. Cool. All right, as a review, I'm going to do a quick high-level run-through of what we just did. So we created our network manager, right? Our shared. We're going to be using networkmanager.share.getAppetizers, right? And if you had more network calls, you'd be using that as well. Same thing with here with our URLs. This is all we're going to have, but that's the structure if you had more URLs. Here we have our function getAppetizer. It has a completion handler that's escaping that returns a result. A result has a success case and a failure case. In the success case, we get back an array of appetizers. In a failure case, we get back an AP error, which we can handle later. So we check to make sure we have a good URL. If we don't have a good URL, return failure with an invalid URL. Here we create our network call with the URL request based on that good URL we got. Our network call is going to either give us back data, response, or an error. So we got to check for all that stuff because they're optional. So if I have an error, cool, return the AP error called unable to complete. If my response is either nil, like I don't get a response, or it's the wrong status code, like a 404, return the failure, invalid response, be done. Same thing. If for some reason I don't have data, okay, return the failure, get out. Now, if we made it past all those checks, we have good data. So now we're going to try to decode that data using our JSON decoder. This is where the codable, decodable protocol comes in. We decode that into an appetizer response, which we created in our model. That appetizer response has a property called request, which is our array of appetizers. So if this all goes well, that means our data was good. We've decoded our array. We have it here. So let's call completed.success. Again, remember, success case gets the appetizer. And so we're going to pass back our array of appetizers in the success. And then if this decoding goes wrong, we pass back invalid data. When your decoding goes wrong, it's, remember I talked about in your appetizer model, how maybe if you had a misspelling here, or if you use image with lowercase URL, like that's when it'll trigger this decoding error down here. So if you're having trouble in other apps or network calls, or even in this one, and this keeps firing off, double check to make sure your model is properly formatted to what you're expecting back from the JSON. And then you call task.resume to actually fire off the network call. So I know that was a lot. If you're familiar with network calls, that was all review, old hat. If you're new to network calls, that may have been a lot. Happy to answer any questions in Slack or in the comments, but our network manager is set up. We're ready to use this. Now we just got to connect it to our list screen, and we're going to handle that in the next video.